Unsquared Dance, Dave Brubeck with Eugene Wright bass and Joe Morello drums, recorded some 40 years ago in New York. Born in Concord, California in 1920, Dave Brubeck received early tuition from his mother, and by the age of 13 was already playing in local bands. Brubeck's formal education was at the College of the Pacific in Stockton and at Mills, which is where he began lessons with an early mentor, Darius Milhaud.
5 of us were studying with him in composition when he asked us to raise our hands if we played jazz. And he said, if you want to, you can use the jazz idiom in all of your compositions. So the octet was actually born in his class.
After that jazz workshop ensemble, you formed a trio with Cal Chader. I know he was involved in that.
Cal came from the octet, and Ron Crody came, and the octet couldn't work. Just a few concerts or free concerts, but there was no way we could make a living. Yeah. So I just took the rhythm section, and boy, we started making a living. And we got a lot of attention with that group. The new combo of the year in Downbeat and Metronome magazines.
When you were working on your piano playing, because you started off playing the piano with your mum teaching you, didn't you?
Trying to teach me. It wasn't too successful. It was great for my older brother, Howard, who was a great classical pianist, a great composer. Yeah. And then my other brother, even older than Howard, it took with them, but not with me. I wanted to play jazz.
Right. So how did you start approaching playing jazz then?
My brother's big band rehearsed in my mother's studio one night a week. Yeah. And I would have been maybe as young as 7 or 8 when I heard jazz right in our front room was the studio. Right. And that band leader is in his late 90s, still alive. His name is Del Courtney. He's in Honolulu now.
Goodness, crazy.
But that band rehearsed in our house too with my brother.
Right, so you had it on your doorstep.
Yeah, and then my brother went with Gil Evans, who was in Stockton, California.
Right.
Where my wife and I first met and went to college. So when Miles Davis recorded The Duke, they invited me to come to the session where they were editing. And when I came in, Miles introduced me to Gil Evans. This is Dave Brubeck. And Gil said, Brubeck, did you have a brother that played drums? And I said, yeah. Was his name Dutch? And that was his nickname. And I said, yeah. He said, man, you know, he played in my band. He's a wonderful drummer. So that's the way I met Gil.
But so in your private time when you were working on stuff, who were the piano players that you really, really liked? Who were you checking out?
My first pianist that I heard on a recording was Billy Kyle.
Oh, yeah.
The Billy Kyle trio in the 30s. And then when I recorded with Louis Armstrong, who do you think's playing piano? Billy Kyle. My first influence here years later, Billy and I were playing 2 pianos on one track with Louis Armstrong singing. Boy, that was really a transition. Then, of course, Teddy Wilson and the great Art Tatum were all early influences. And the first recording that I bought personally was Fats Waller's there's Honey on the Moon Tonight,
Mm-hmm.
and Let's Be Fair and Square in Love. Those two, it was a big event in my life to buy that recording.
I always thought you must have an incredible affinity with Thelonious Monk, because even though you both play very differently, when I listen to you, I hear this kind of very unsentimental, angular type of playing that is obviously extremely rhythmical, but at the same time it has this sort of luscious melody. Like when I think about the way you write with the famous tunes like In Your Own Sweet Way and The Duke, the melody is so strong and so lyrical, and yet you juxtapose that with this very sort of, in-your-face, gritty type of playing. Was this something you developed out of necessity, out of a kind of natural development, or something that you were actually thinking of? I want to put these two things together.
What you said is exactly what Paul Desmond told me once.
Mm-hmm.
He said, there's a great similarity between you and Monk. I never heard Monk when Paul said that.
Right.
But it's a funny thing, after the war, if you can use the term anger, I was so angry about what had happened to my friends that didn't make it, and all what went on, especially in Europe, that I think I played a much harsher kind of piano, getting the war out of me. And Paul thinks that I was the most radical when he first knew me. He thought, the first time he heard me, he said something like, this guy's mad out of his mind, because I was playing in two keys at once, and Paul had never heard of people doing that.
Yeah.
And Paul said if we had gone to New York after we first got together, we would have shocked them.
Yeah.
Because by the time we got to New York, we were tamer.
Right.
Paul was screeching on the alto. You never think of you always think of him as a lyrical player.
Yeah.
Let me tell you, when he was a kid, he was a wild man.
Le Souk from Brubeck's first album for Columbia, recorded in 1954 at Oberlin College, Ohio. Paul Desmond was on alto, Bob Bates bass, and Joe Dodge drums. The quartet was to be Brubeck's main vehicle for years to come, with the addition of Eugene Wright and Joe Morello on bass and drums by '58. The album Time Out saw Brubeck experimenting more with odd time signatures such as 5 and 9. It was also one of the best-selling jazz albums of all time. I asked Dave what he made of the public response.
A total surprise and not intentional. I was trying to do an experimental album, and Columbia Records did not want to put it out. And it took them a long time to put it out. And then it took them a long time to put out the single, Blue Rondo and Take 5. Because the sales force said it would not work with the public. It was the disc jockeys that launched this thing in spite of the president of Columbia wanted to put it out the first time he heard it, because he was a musician, Goddard Lieberson.
Right.
It took him a year to get his own company to put it out. They said, look, you've got a painting on the cover. All your tunes are in odd meters that people can't dance to, and you've got all originals on one album, and we're against that. If you're going to use originals, you should space it with show tunes and pop tunes. You got a whole album of originals. That'll never work.
Right.
And it became their biggest album for years.
Wow. So by breaking the mold, it turned into this incredible commercial success. Amazing.
But it wasn't intended to be.
No.
Take 5 was supposed to be a drum solo in 5 for Joe Morello.
Right.
And that beat, junk, boom, boom, boom,
Yeah.
that was Joe's.
Right, I see.
And then Paul started putting melodies over it backstage before a concert, before we were going on.
Right.
And I was doing this album, Time Out. I said, Paul, try and write some of this down.
Yeah.
So he wrote down some of the themes, but he didn't write a tune. When he came to rehearsal, he said, I can't write a tune in 5/4. I've tried and tried and tried. I said, let me see what you did. And I said, Paul, you know, if you take this theme and make a bridge out of it, and repeat this, and you got a great tune. And that's the way the tune was born, was in rehearsal. Paul has done some interviews where he talks about it. He said in one interview, I shudder to think of how we almost lost the bridge to Take 5. He almost lost it because he didn't know he had a bridge till I told him.
I've read that you describe yourself as a composer who plays the piano.
Yeah.
Can you quantify that a bit more for me?
I think of myself when I'm playing as a composer.
I see.
Now, once in a while, I'll think of myself more as a pianist and switch that back to a pianist that composes from a composer that plays a piano. But this is what I found was lacking in some of the greatest pianists. I've worked with them, and they were playing a lot of the same stuff every night. If you work in a club where you're hearing another group, say for 2 weeks, pretty quick you know what each guy's going to do unless they're creative guys. And there's some guys that are so great you don't know what they're going to do. But there's others that are accepted as great, and they are great, but they're not creative.
No.
They're great technically. And that's not bad to be great technically. But when you know almost what's going to happen, with me, I don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
If I'm really playing my best, it will come from a different source than material that I've practiced or know. And that's what I think a jazz musician should be doing. I've worked with Tatum, and I can tell you that Tiger Rag 1938 is almost note for note 1956 when he recorded it again.
Yeah.
But I can also tell you that he could have turned around and played that 20 different ways. But he preferred to be clean in front of the public, never to make a mistake, and absolute technique that was unbelievable. But he was the most creative guy I've ever known. And you get him after hours, and he'll scare you to death. He's so creative.
Why is it like that, that after hours you really get a glimpse of who the musician is? I've always wondered that. Because, you know, sometimes I would rehearse with my band, and just in rehearsal, because, you know, there's no pressure, it's purely about the music, and you're sort of experimenting with things, you really get the great performances. You really get that whole surprise, that whole creative thing that you're talking about, that which to me, just as you said, is what differentiates a jazz musician. You shouldn't know exactly what you're going to do all the time. You should be able to sort of live on the edge and take that and create something new every time you go out there.
Right.
But I wonder why it is that when that often happens in your downtime rather than your on time, you know.
It's that so many guys don't want to make a mistake in public. And I feel like if you're really playing, there should be a lot of mistakes.
Absolutely.
You should be trying things that that if they come off, they're brilliant,
Mm-hmm.
and but if they don't, you go on to the next thing.
Yeah.
One way I used to practice was to hit chords and then make them as wild as possible and then resolve them.
Right.
Because my philosophy was, in life, you make mistakes. But if you can resolve that mistake, you can go on. In the same way, when you're playing jazz, if you make a mistake, you can weave that mistake into what's going to happen and follow. And pretty quick, the mistake is the beauty of what's going to happen later, because that mistake puts you in a new place. And, you know, people thought that Paul and I played so well together that Paul said we had ESP.
Mm-hmm.
And one night on the opening part of a tune, where you always play the same until you get to the improvisation,
Mm-hmm.
we both made the same mistake on a tune we'd played for years. And those kind of things, you wonder, well, how could that happen?
Yeah.
And Paul was always saying, yeah, you can hear him on recordings, or I'm saying yeah to
Mm-hmm.
Paul, because we were always surprising each other.
It's a Raggy Waltz, the Dave Brubeck Quartet in '63. Paul Desmond alto, Eugene Wright bass, and Joe Morello drums. Desmond left the group in '67, and those replacing him on reeds have included Jerry Mulligan, Jerry Bergonzi, and Bill Smith. It's Smith who's featured here on a BBC recording from 1992. Jack Six is on bass and Randy Jones drums. This is a composition by Dave's brother Howard called Theme for June. Dave Brubeck, recorded by the BBC in 1992, with Bill Smith clarinet, Jack Six bass, and Randy Jones drums. Dave Brubeck turned 80 last year and continues to amaze audiences with his quartet, now featuring altoist Bobby Militello. His innovations have broadened the language of jazz and inspired musicians of every kind. To end today, we go back to 1972, Jerry Mulligan baritone and Brubeck's old friend Paul Desmond on alto. Jack Six is on bass and Alan Dawson drums. This is Truth.
Truth by Dave Brubeck, recorded in Berlin in 1972 with Paul Desmond, alto, Jerry Mulligan, baritone, Jack Six, bass, and Alan Dawson on drums. Jazz Legends was presented by Julian Joseph. Well, now here's Jez Nelson with a look ahead to Jazz on 3 tonight.
On this week's show, veteran UK bassist Dave Green touches on John Coltrane and Ornette Coleman in a challenging and surprising session with his trio featuring New York drummer Gene Calderazzo and saxophonist Ian Dixon. Plus, I'll be rounding up the best new jazz releases on CD, including the latest from the classic pairing of Archie Shepp and Roswell Rudd. And don't forget the Jazz on 3 website, where you'll find an interview with Dave Green and, believe it or not, a film of his entire session.
That's Jez Nelson, and you'll find that session on the jazz part of the Radio 3 website. That's bbc.co.uk/Radio 3. And Jazz on 3 is tonight at 11:30 here on BBC Radio 3. Now it's 5 o'clock, and